So let me start with the patients again. As we go into this phase, it's been, again, I think, a rich conversation. What are we still missing? Or would you like to help set the context for the next hour as we talk about coverage and pricing and other things? Is there anything else that somehow the conversation has swerved around or that we need to refocus on? Anything at all?
So for me, I guess let's echo a little bit. One piece of the conversation that's been missing a little bit is just the process in terms of evaluating coverage policies. And I think one of my personal frustrations in that context is that it's the same one that I have in the regulatory evaluation process, which is with rare disease. There are very few experts in the country who have the experience to speak to treatment benefit in an informed and knowledgeable way. Mm-hmm. And so on the regulatory front, they are often considered conflicted because they've served as PIs in a study, which I don't agree with, because every physician that I have interacted with in the Duchenne community as well as in the rare disease community in general is just because they're PIs in studies doesn't necessarily make them agents of a sponsor. You know, they're serving our community and they're serving our children first and foremost. And so I would like to see those regulations revisited in the same way that I would like to see the consideration of the expertise brought on board in making these coverage decisions included, so that the input from doctors like Dr. King and Giaffoloni are the primary experts guiding policy, mm-hmm. Instead of potentially some internal payer staff that may not have ever seen nor treated right. A patient with these particular diseases.
Right. Well, yes, I mean, a lot of people don't realize there are well over 1,000 different private insurers in the United States, and each of them are forced, if you will, to make their own coverage decision. They can't talk to each other about it. They have to make it on their own. And those processes really do differ a lot in terms of the richness of the input that they get from patients, from clinical experts, and how they look at the evidence. So our report does at least hopefully offer one opportunity, again, for the patient voice, for a judgment about the evidence, and for clinical expert input to have some role. So I agree with you. And actually, before we go further, forgive me again, I've forgotten social graces. We have two new members of the Roundtable, and I should let them introduce themselves because we are going to be talking about coverage, and we have two insurer representatives. So John and Eric, would you mind introducing yourselves, please?
Hi, I'm John Watkins from Primera Blue Cross in Seattle. I manage the formulary system. We actually have an external committee that does what you were just describing. None of us vote on it. We don't have this level of subspecialized expertise, but we consult usually local whenever we need, and we'll bring those people in.
Okay, Eric?
All right, thank you, Steve, for inviting me here today to provide an aspect of the payer perspective. This is my third opportunity to join ICER for some very difficult conversations, this one being of that spinal muscular atrophy and cystic fibrosis. I'm a clinical pharmacist at United Healthcare, where our commercial book of business provides coverage for over 28 million commercial lives, representing over 200,000 commercial clients. I'm a clinical pharmacist responsible for the clinical review and clinical development of programs for specialty medications with a focus on rare disease, orphan drugs, and emerging technologies. I wanted to thank the patient families, advocates for your comments today, and the panel for this difficult but necessary conversation. I think the provision of the patient perspective is critical context in the discussion of any pharmacoeconomic analyses, and looking forward to the conversation we had today.
Great, thanks. And I guess I'll mention that we have an empty chair here. There are actually two, because we invited the manufacturers, as we always do, to participate in the overall process from day one to inform us. They don't even have to come to the final meeting, but both manufacturers opted out of that for their own reasons, which they've stated publicly. So we obviously are disappointed that they're not here to participate in this kind of discussion. It doesn't mean that we're going to dodge issues related to their role in the system and what we can do better going forward. So just to note that we would have them here, and we wish they were here, but they chose not to participate. I have to ask you one other thing, patients, because this comes up, I know it comes up at some point. We talked about evidence already. What's it like to be called anecdotal? How does that play? How does it feel?
So I'll address that. I probably have the most anecdotal evidence available, years of experience. And ultimately, we do realize we're an N of 1. There is so much heterogeneity within the community, even within my family. Matthew stopped walking at age 8. Patrick was 13. The genotypical, phenotypical analysis wouldn't work for them. But in looking at the outcomes, their abilities, their compensatory technique, the way that they live their lives, that's important to us, and I think that that's important for informing not only medical decisions, but also the drug development process. And when we look at the discussions that were had today and people's concern about the methodology and the fact that we're not capturing all the data about functional benefit correctly, this is how you achieve that. And the prior question was about what we hoped, what are some of the burdens, some of the challenges, and that's part of it, is how do we impact that development process so we're able to more accurately manage what is important, because ambulation, when you look at Duchenne, a significant proportion of the community are off their feet. But are they any less valuable to their family members and to community? I would offer that no. And so the looking at the disease course and how it relates to my family and informing our decisions, and when we make a value judgment about treatment, or when we look at what potential therapies or that are coming up the pipeline we support, those are all part of that decision making, and that anecdotal evidence is what informs us to make those decisions.
All right. Let me just, I feel like a lawyer. I've got materials. I've got things to read here. Some of it, it's all in the public domain. It's things that, and we're not going to relitigate in depth the whole thing at the FDA, but we have to start there a little bit and maybe reflect back on it, because it continues to cast a shadow, certainly, over this area. And I'm ultimately going to ask whether we have positive things to learn or negative things to learn from the experience of the evidence base that came forward through the FDA and that guides clinical practice 3 years after approval and is trying to guide insurance coverage. So let me just read kind of some statements about, and this comes from various sources. Trying to figure out what's the best way to start here. But again, many people know that inside the FDA, I don't know if anybody's been inside the FDA. It's a pretty quiet kind of, people don't go to the FDA for knife fights and kind of gang wars. They're kind of evidence nerds like we are, and it's a pretty sedate place in general. They take their jobs very seriously. So to have the kind of level of disagreement and real strong challenges to the way the decisions were made is very, very unusual. So as you know, there was strong internal disagreement over the way that the evidence was judged and created. And for the clinical experts who are also familiar, more recently with the spinal muscular atrophy drugs that have come to market, and again, somewhat similar clinical scenario of more rapidly perhaps progressive neurologic condition, and the types of evidence that were generated and what we knew at launch about those two drugs versus what we're grappling with eteplirsen and perhaps golodirsen. What's your feeling on whether we have positive or negative lessons to learn about the body of evidence that was available for eteplirsen when it came through 3 years ago? Peter, you want to start?
Well, what I can say is right now, there's a significant number of patients who are receiving eteplirsen And I think there's a really nice opportunity 3 years after approval to try to gather as much data as possible from those patients, even if it's observational and open label, and learn more. And so that's definitely an opportunity for us to gather more data.
Emma, what would you say?
Yeah, I will definitely say the learning curve in the past 5 years in the Duchenne field has been unprecedented. And I think that we should always look, even in uncomfortable situation or imprecise situation, to always get out the positives. And the positive is, you know, are we learning more about better outcome measures, or maybe more, you know, combination of outcome measures, and how to measure things? You know, do we really know how much dystrophin can really make a difference? You know, there are things that simply we don't know, and we can learn much faster now just because the momentum and the exposure to new drugs. So I will say that is definitely a very positive moment. So I think that everyone in the field, of the families, the providers, everyone is learning. Could we learn even more? Absolutely. And we should continue the effort. But I think that these have been positive lessons.
So let me just read one other quote, a different perspective, obviously, from the acting chief scientist of the FDA at the time, who wrote internally, "Granting accelerated approval here on the basis of the data submitted could make matters worse for patients with no existing meaningful therapies, both by discouraging others from developing effective therapies for DMD and by encouraging other developers to seek approval for serious conditions before they have invested the time and research necessary to establish whether a product is likely to confer clinical benefit. If we were to approve eteplirsen without substantial evidence of effectiveness or on the basis of a surrogate endpoint with a trivial treatment effect, we would quickly find ourselves in the position of having to approve a myriad of ineffective treatments for groups of desperate patients." Why is that wrong?
I want to speak to all of those questions, the anecdotal piece particularly, and then that issue as well. So I find it incredibly dismissive when our observations are characterized as anecdotal. So, I mean, in the years in which this whole roller coaster took place, I mean, we've started a research organization particularly to address the concerns that FDA brought up. And because we want to capture this type of evidence in a rigorous, standardized, and prospective fashion, I mean, that's why we're doing the work that we do at Casimir. And it is to work within the methodology that's accepted where we consider that appropriate, but it is also to push the paradigm in ways that it needs to be pushed to accommodate evidence gathering in rare disease. So, I mean, and there are conventions that are widely accepted within that methodology that I think need challenging. For example, if you capture data in the clinic, it is by definition considered more rigorous than if you take a look at real world data captured at home. But what isn't under consideration when that happens is that just the very nature of taking a medically fragile child and flying, you know, him or her across the country 4 hours is a confounding factor in that data collection. When you put a kid with Duchenne on an airplane, there's something vasoconstrictive, circulatory, I don't know what it is, but they're weak as soon as they get off that plane. And so if you have somebody who's randomized to one arm that lives 20 minutes from clinic, and you have somebody who's randomized to another arm that has to fly 4 hours every week to their clinical trial site to be assessed, that's a confounder. And so in addition, I think there's the piece of this idea that if we use, you know, PRO type evidence, that anything that's quantifiable is by definition more rigorous than anything that's described qualitatively. You know, and I filled out those questionnaires time after time after time, and I can tell you that I have no idea how difficult it is for my son to pour a half gallon of milk, because we are a family of 5 and we buy gallons, and I have never seen him pour a half gallon of milk in my entire life. And yet somehow when I fill that out in a questionnaire about whether that's slightly, moderately, or significantly difficult for him to do, that is by definition more rigorous than saying, look, I know that his condition is changing because I measure the distance that I park from the school door and how difficult it is for him to walk from that distance every day on a daily basis. So in that way, I think we as patients are trying to push the paradigm in ways that it needs to be pushed to get at the truth in rare disease. But at the same time, you know, all of these advocacy organizations are trying to work within the methodology that's considered acceptable, but not to compromise the truth.
Mm-hmm. I understand.
Yeah. And I would just add, I think it's dangerous for us to spend too much time going back on that FDA discussion. I was in the room that day, one of many Duchenne families in the room, and the same former chief medical officer that you're referring to also stood up in front of the entire room of Duchenne families and suggested that some of the test results could be anecdotal because they were willing themselves to walk. So boys were willing themselves to walk due to patient and family coaching. So I just think we have to be careful about what we're calling anecdotal evidence and how we're defining that across the community. So I love the fact that we're inclusive in our conversations and we're thinking about including the patient perspective. I don't think anyone would argue that that's necessary, but I think we just have to be careful about what we're going to define as that anecdotal evidence and don't go too far down a certain path.
Right. As you guys know very well, there is a tension between trying to expand the nuance of outcome measures and making it almost personalized for the individual patient, because sometimes the best way to measure the outcomes for one patient with a condition needs to be different, and it gets really complicated then to measure effects over a group. So there's always a tension between those two. I will say, partly because Sarepta's not here, and I really don't appreciate that they're not here, and because I would love to hear their thoughts on this, but this is the weakest effort I've ever seen for a company to try to do good research and bring it to the FDA. They picked an outcome measure that was assuming a huge impact of their drug, and when they didn't find it, it just doesn't seem, the FDA says they didn't do the further work that we asked them to do. The FDA says that they exhibited serious irresponsibility by publishing and promoting selective data during the development of the program, and that I think they left the patient community in a tremendous bind where a drug that got approved is either, as one of them said, an elegant placebo, and we've heard lots of information to say that that may not be true, or the evidence was so weak that it triggered an instant reaction by the payer community, somewhat in outrage that the evidence was so much weaker than they usually see, and because of the price being so high, it's led to a lot of conflicts over coverage and may have diminished the opportunity to do the kinds of research necessary. And to be fair, other FDAs around the world have looked at this evidence and said no. The Europeans said no. They have a one-paragraph reason. It basically just says, the main study had 12 patients, did not compare Exondys with placebo beyond 24 weeks. The methods for comparing results of the main studies with historical data were not satisfactory for showing that the medicine was effective. They considered further data were needed to show that the very low amounts of shortened dystrophin produced as a result of Exondys treatment bring lasting benefits relevant to the patient. They said no. And to my knowledge, Canada, Australia, no one else has approved this drug to this point, waiting for the better research and evidence that we can see. Spark, a very small company, biotech company, with a progressive blindness condition of children, went through the effort of creating its own patient-centered outcome measure to capture the nuances for patients who couldn't see in low light, did a randomized trial, followed patients for up to 5 to 6 years before they came to the FDA, and they got approval, and the payer community might not have liked the price, but they liked the evidence. They said, this is what we see as reasonable evidence on which to start to make policy. So John and Eric, when you guys as payers saw this body of evidence coming through, what was your impression? Did this seem like another orphan condition and we see this, or did this one stick out in some way? And what would you say were some of the ramifications for how coverage was considered in the early days?
It definitely did, and it was the worst case scenario for us because the approval was one day before our meeting of our committee, when we thought it probably would not be approved because the advisory committee had voted against it. So there was a knee-jerk reaction. However, we have ended up covering it as it is labeled. That is with some faith in the outcomes that we are now beginning to see. But it's very difficult with such a small number of people. And it's interesting that the ICER two-dimensional matrix that scores quality of evidence emphasizes the fact that you have both an effect and you also have the level of confidence is normally expressed statistically or however it is. So when you combine those two, the point is, if the effect is really huge, then I believe it even if the other dimension is relatively weaker. So to take a counterexample, if you look at the gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy that we were talking about here several months ago, there's no question that patients are getting massive benefit from it. So here we're arguing about a very small incremental improvement. And we struggled with the idea that dystrophin levels should be taken as an endpoint. Furthermore, one of you folks talked about multiple surgeries for patients this morning. If we had a functional endpoint that was agreed on, we wouldn't have to keep doing that, would we? I'll ask the clinicians, would you mind if we deferred that one if you were seeing clinical results?
Eric, why don't you go ahead and...
Yeah, so in my opinion, it's probably been one of the 4 seminal events I can think of when looking at evolution of specialty pharmaceutical products and more, orphan conditions. I put it on par with when Kalydeco was approved, when Sivasavir was approved, or Sovaldi, along with the gene therapies products, whether focusing more on Zolgensma, but also with Luxturna, and then the approval for this in September of 2016. And in rereading this report and the background information, I can't deny that my blood pressure went up rereading it. It brought back all of those emotions that we had, and the emotions for the families put in the middle of this tug of war, but also the bar or the threshold of evidence that the FDA mandates and can future mandate. And then, the emotion and the thoughts that I have is that while we're waiting for the confirmation of the evidence that was a requirement, we're going back to the well for now exon 53 and 45. So it's like it was a loophole opened that's now getting exploited again. But while we're trying to really confirm, does this drug work for the larger population? So yeah, it's an interesting event, to say the least.
So we're going to talk more about the specifics of the coverage policies and how you translate the label and the evidence behind it into a coverage policy, and we'll talk about the pricing later too. Whether this is a topic better for later in the afternoon or for now, I was fascinated by the reaction from the biotech community. I had several CEOs come to me saying, this is a travesty. We are a science-based company. We want the bar to be high, because if not, then our competitors who don't do good science can get there earlier than we can, and we're not willing to lower our standards of science behind our products. And if our competitive landscape is suddenly shifted, we may lose to companies that aren't willing to do good clinical research. There was a well-known kind of biotech columnist who writes for a science translational group that basically favors kind of innovation, if you will. And he said, I think Sarepta should have run a better trial, should have gathered more data when the FDA told them to. Instead, the company stood pat, mobilized families, and won over Janet Woodcock, and that appears to be enough these days. Is that the new way to get a drug approved? I share the worries that this might open the floodgates, because after all, Sarepta got their drug through. So this may seem really hard. These are for people who want biotech innovation for ultra-rare diseases, and they're concerned by the precedent that Sarepta set and the FDA set in this case. I feel like patients are caught in the middle again, but I'd be welcome to your perspective. Is there some way to frame the future? When golodirsen comes forward, is there any way that the FDA can have a different standard now, a higher standard than they did for Exondys 51? It's hard to imagine how they could gear back up. Or are you happy with where you think things were for eteplirsen? I know you're not, because you want better outcome measures.
Well, so first of all, I don't think any of us here can speculate on what the FDA could or should do. I think that the idea that this is somehow setting precedent is not accurate. I always get really offended by the characterization of those of us who spoke to FDA about this as, pawns of the sponsor in some way. I know this data backwards and forwards. I can sit alongside neurodivision reviewers and speak to it to a level of granularity that they can as well. And as I said kind of earlier in this conversation, this was a very unique context of development that is not faced by any other sponsors. I don't think they were faced with an ultra rare disease of which you're looking at 13% of an ultra rare disease that are amenable to this particular exon, and you had a situation in which those patients were already utilized in a competitor's program. So I think that Dr. Woodcock considered the context of the development, understood that she had two choices. There was going to be an accelerated approval where we would be able to learn more and hopefully get definitive information at some point in time once things were followed, for a long enough period of time, or FDA could insist on, a larger scale phase 3 study that would never enroll. And that was the choice that they were faced with. And so I think, she made that decision that knowing is better than not knowing. And that was the basis for the decision. And I don't think that is fully appreciated in the understanding of what happened throughout that. Having said that, it has been 3 years. I would like more data. There are a number of challenges, that present themselves towards gathering that data. But again, it's a frustration for all of us that we don't have it.
Yeah. I'm going to circle back to the follow-up study and what we might expect of it or otherwise. In terms of this being a different situation from the clinical expert perspective, is it different because there's a perception that there are essentially no side effects of this treatment? How different would it be if this were a treatment that had some risks or at least some more of a whiff of a danger that could be lurking on the horizon? Everything we heard from very, very early days inside the FDA, where there were some risks, at least with some doses, it just seemed to go away and there was absolutely no concern about side effects. How does that affect the clinical experts' view of the use and the evidence necessary to justify the use for these treatments?
Well, I think that as clinician, safety is a huge weight in the balance of how to make the best decision for that particular patient and family at that time in their disease course. And so safety, of course, is a huge factor. And this happened to be an antisense that, safety-wise has panned out extremely well, unlike some predecessor that, had very poor safety effect. So that is part of the conversation.
Yeah, I definitely review side effects of any treatment with families so that, and as I said before, I try to make it a collaborative process, so that definitely would weigh in on a decision. Yeah.
I mean, I just think psychologically, having, practiced medicine, and I know the sense when a treatment doesn't seem to have any side effects, it's just how much confidence you have to have in the evidence of its benefit. It feels like a different equation in a way, how much certainty you have to have. So I think that's just part of the reality of also what I think, Mindy, you said is somewhat unique for this drug, because most drugs when they come through have some risks or side effects or harms that people are worried about as far as the uncertainty on the benefit. Here it felt like that kind of fell away and it was really just a concern about whether there was adequate evidence on the benefit side. Am I right?
But I think it's part of the individual calculus that every family is making, because this is medicalizing these children's lives at a time when that isn't necessarily the case, and so all of us are evaluating that critically. I think clinicians and families are evaluating that critically as part of the calculus in terms of individual treatment. These are kids that would go to the doctor annually, that right. are then receiving weekly infusion. So
that's a big change.
There's there's side effects, and then there's quality of life and impact on that front as well.
Brian?
So I don't think that the treatment is completely without side effect. When you look at implanting a Metaport into a patient, because their vasculature is extraordinarily impaired because of a lack of dystrophin. I mean, these are risks that people have to, the mental calisthenics that we're undergoing to make a determination of whether or not to pursue this treatment. I think these are part of that process and the analysis that we wind up having to make. And it's in my mind, looking at drug in clinical trial versus in the lived experience are two very different events. And I think that part of the answer to your prior question about looking at how to do this differently is possibly a public policy effort and in a decision that is made to capture more of that information through the process so that, especially with new treatments, you're collecting data so that you can be supportive of whether or not something is truly showing clinical benefit in a subset of the population, the entire population, or some number in between.
Okay, good. So I'm going to try to turn to what may seem kind of dry and boring, but it's some of the ways that coverage policies vary across insurers in the United States. And anytime there's a variable in coverage, it raises tension for clinicians and certainly for patients and families. And again, there may not be obviously a best practice, but let's get some perspectives on some of these issues. So actually, why don't we skip to steroids? We'll start with steroids, and we'll get back to their empty chair in a minute, don't worry. But I'm going to cover a couple of the key questions that come up in coverage policy that varies across insurers, and you guys can comment from your own perspective how it factored into your thinking, and just in general, how you think of using evidence to create your coverage policies. In steroid policy, there are a couple of key issues. One is if the patients become non-ambulatory, should coverage continue for deflazacort?
So in our policy for deflazacort, we have no ambulatory function requirement for that. We do for the clients who have elected step therapy programs for their health benefit. They expect us to have patients try efficacious, lower cost medications before that. Mm-hmm. So we do have deflazacort in a step therapy program, but we don't have an ambulatory component to that. Okay,
I'll come to step therapy in a second. John, do you remember the issues around the evidence on whether it applies to patients who are non-ambulatory?
We have step therapy also, so because the evidence is, as you've discussed, relatively weak in terms of the question of whether it's incrementally superior to prednisone, then we say, since that is the case, yes, there are probably some patients for whom it makes a difference. Why don't you start with the one that costs a teeny fraction of as much? And by the way, why is this drug available in Canada for 1% of the U.S. price?
Ask the person to your left. We'll get to him in a second. Yes, please, Brian.
So I've looked at a number of these coverage policies, and I've seen an extraordinary range of requirements, from step therapies to a 6-minute time walk test of 180 to 330 meters for an individual for Emflaza, to looking at a baseline of North Star and a 10-meter walk. I think that there is a foundational misunderstanding about functional benefit in Duchenne. Again, I go back to my comment earlier about the fact that the lion's share of the community are off their feet. But preservation of upper body function, and if the drug does that, is very different than monitoring ambulatory status. And so that looking for a 2-point increase in a particular measure, or looking for a maintenance of a certain distance within a 6-minute, which has actually no relevance in a patient's life, tells me that we're either looking for impediments to continuation of drug, or we just don't understand what functional benefit is.
And just to confirm quickly, clinical experts, any clinical reason why the effectiveness of a drug would make it so that the risk-benefit equation would shift if a patient became non-ambulatory?
I think that the field and what we know now has shifted towards not stopping corticosteroids once the loss of ambulation, because of the benefits that we know on delaying cardiomyopathy, respiratory failure, scoliosis. I think that most of us in the field that do Duchenne as a primary interest now believe that continuing steroids indefinitely has pretty good evidence.
Okay. So here's what happens, and I'm going to ask the payers again to comment on this in a general way. It'll come up for eteplirsen for sure. So the clinical studies that are cited by the FDA as the reason to approve it have certain eligibility criteria. It could be age, it could be functional status, it could be what have you. And the approval is for patients with the condition. Payers look at the eligibility criteria for the study and they say, well, we don't have evidence on everybody with the condition. We have evidence on these patients, ages 7 to 13, who have the ability to do this but not that, or what have you. And they plug that into their prior auth criteria to require that they fit those criteria before getting coverage. So that happens, sometimes more standard and just kind of plug and play than others. What do you think is best practice? How do we frame this? Is there how would you describe the tension that you feel when you're trying to make a decision about whether to have a no prior auth or a prior auth that's this big when the study is on this subset of patients with the condition? And any insights on how we should create some kind of recommendation around how that would apply in this case? John?
Yeah, it's individual to the case, and I think probably every payer would answer a little bit differently. But to take two extreme examples, both of which have been mentioned today, the Kalydeco, the first drug for the cystic fibrosis patients, was originally studied, if I remember correctly, in patients 6 years old and older. However, if you look at what's going on there, there's no reason to think that younger patients wouldn't benefit, and the reason they weren't in the trial is because they couldn't follow the protocol, which is fairly complex. This involves respiratory therapy type stuff. You have to basically be a certain age in order to do it. And in fact, the cost effectiveness modeling, as I recall, found that the earlier you started, the lower the ICER would be. So that one made total sense. On the other hand, if you look at Zolgensma, the gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy, if you go past a certain, we saw in the study that the older the patients were, the less benefit they got. Extrapolate that a little bit further, and the FDA said 2 years. So there's no reason to think that a 5-year-old with type 1, if they even miraculously survive that long, that they would benefit. So this one probably somewhere in between. And again, because of the amount of uncertainty, I think we basically defaulted in favor of the patients.
Mm-hmm. Eric, any comment?
Yeah, so, I think as I try to think of it, it's a compassionate evidence-based medicine approach. And so if you think that the patient population is a good representation of the entire population, there can be potential for expansion. However, when you get situations where you see that the patient population studied was selected for a reason that puts doubt into the alternative population, there's a question there. And so there's been recent examples. So like Radicava for ALS was approved, and it was studied in a select patient population, but it's because it was studied in a more advanced population earlier and showed not just non-efficacy but worsening of outcomes. And so then the subsequent study that got its approval was in this select patient population. So in that case, it's a more strict application of the clinical trial evidence in the approval criteria. Similar with like ocrelizumab and primary progressive MS was, it was also studied with rituximab, a very similar compound, in more aggressive patients, and those patients didn't respond, so the ocrelizumab study was more focused in what they thought would be the positive outcome. And so that's sometimes the application. And so when looking at Exondys, again, with all of the caveats of the heterogeneity of the individual patients, on top of the fact that this 201 study had 4 patients in an arm and two progressed relatively rapidly, but there was different patient inclusion criteria in there, and I think to Mindy's head, one aspect was those patients included may have been too far gone. And so when we're trying to balance that access is to get the patients who can truly benefit, or do we think can truly benefit, is grant that early access for those patients defined in the clinical trials or in the confirmation studies as decided on by the manufacturer, and then allow the manufacturer to expand that evidence base to let us expand our access.
Okay, so again, just as a general principle, it sounds like obviously payers have a choice when there's an FDA label, but an evidence base that's in a sense more narrow or targeted to certain kinds of patients, and that it's not reasonable perhaps to make the prior auth restricted to just those patients if there's no kind of clinical justification for why it wouldn't work for other patients. Although there's always going to be a gray zone where there might be some suggestion that it's less effective or not effective. The FDA still gives a broad indication, and payers are now wondering, should I use the eligibility criteria as my prior auth? And that's where we get variability.
And I would say there's even variability in the FDA decisions, because we talk about you talk about the review and the FDA review and the evaluation that was done on the CAR T therapies. And that was studied in a very select patient population in a difficult to treat pediatric population. Yeah. And the label aligned directly with the patient population study. So that was easy. Simple in the evaluation of the pharmacoeconomics, but also simple in the application of access.
Yeah, yeah. So we talk a little bit about how the world works in the biotech community. How the world works in the insurer community can also create an unpleasant scenario, which is when a new drug comes out and there is a gray zone between leaving the prior auth broad or narrow with the eligibility criteria. The plans have to make their own coverage decisions, but they start looking around, and if they figure that their approach is going to be more lenient, then they might attract all the patients with that very expensive condition. And so they say, oops, no, we can't be more lenient than our competitor. We have to also be relatively strict. Otherwise, we get what's called adverse selection, and it's kind of a race to the bottom. Is there any way we can avoid that from happening in your mind? Because I know that's a real feature of what we see with some of these situations.
Our clinical review of the evidence guides our policies. Others may have a different view. But it is a constant fear of mine is that if we have appropriate broad access to some of these therapies, like I said, we have over 200,000 customers that are self-insured, or many of them self-insured. And if they don't feel like we're managing their health benefits, they can go to another payer who can take a different approach. And not only could that approach be tighter access, it could be inappropriate access, or it could even be no access. And so if there's a regional health plan that says we can't cover Duchenne, we can't cover gene therapy, we can't cover dermatologic agents for psoriasis, and because that's what it does, that's what it takes to get that business, that's not helping anybody.
No.
John, anything you'd like to add?
No, I agree, and we don't play that game. Where the evidence is clear, we're going to go with it. As I said, where the effect size is dramatic, then we're much more willing. And the way I usually conceptualize it is there's almost always a leap of faith. A clinician can't really say, I give you, patient, 100% guarantee this is going to work for you. I may be pretty sure But we were taught in pharmacy school, always qualify, never make absolute statements. This will make you better. But there are teeny tiny leaps of faith, and there are Grand Canyon leaps of faith. Somewhere in between lie most of them. And so the bigger the leap, the more you're going to stop and think before you jump. And the little ones, we pretty much, we have so much stuff coming at us these days that we oftentimes will say, well, I'll give them that one because I feel pretty confident. Again, we're confident with the results of Zolgensma, even though, again, it was an equally small number of patients.
Right.
But the effect is very dramatic.
Right. So again, kind of ticking the boxes on the ways that coverage policy for deflazacort is handled, then we'll pivot to Exondys again. For the renewal of deflazacort, is there any reason to have some criteria for coverage to check it after a 6-month period to get attestation that it's working before continuing with deflazacort? Insurers often just stick that on an expensive medication. Is there any clinical rationale to benefit from a check-in with the clinical expert or the clinician on whether deflazacort is still working?
I mean, we're not really looking at improvement or points going up, right? At that point, for the vast majority of real-life patients, we're really looking at slowing down the slope of progression. So people will still worsen a little bit, but we don't know compared to themselves will have worsened faster and more without the fact. So I think that's pretty an irrational approach to require reauthorization every 6 months.
All right. So let me pivot then to step therapy. Everybody's favorite medical policy, right? Oh. Yeah. Especially the clinicians, patients too. Okay, so you've heard the justification. There's an effective drug. It's so much less expensive. Some kids will have bad side effects. So let's assume that there's step therapy, and it says you have to fail prednisone. What is failure? How do you guys build failure in? Is it just a clinician saying bad side effects, so now they need deflazacort? Do you ask for documentation of weight gain or of Cushingoid appearance? Do you have your own tick box? How do you think that should be done? And I know you guys always have to reflect on what you are doing, but also kick it out if you see other ways that you think aren't appropriate to do it or other things, lessons that we can learn. So how to frame step therapy for prednisone to deflazacort in a responsible fashion. What's it look like?
So obviously it varies within the industry. And some will just a documentation of claim evidence of prednisone could be sufficient enough, could be physician attestation that they've tried prednisone and not failure with regards to efficacy, but development of intolerant side effects. I think are the two standard definitions of step therapy.
John, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, how rigorously you apply that, I think, is going to depend on the cost of the medication and the delta and the leap of faith involved. So in some cases, particularly if the drug is very expensive, we will ask to see some chart notes. That is one of the most common reasons for denial is just lack of that. And it's frustrating because if you just give us what we're asking for, then chances are we're going to say yes. In other cases, again, we're not trying to create extra paperwork for people. So many times we will accept an attestation or, for example, we have a step therapy on the small amount of remaining brand statins that are out there. So if you show me, and again, this is an electronic look back in our claims history, if we see 2 different generic statins within the last 6 months, the edit doesn't even fire.
Got it.
So that happens almost instantaneously, prescription processes, and off you go.
Okay. From the clinical expert experience, I saw you jumping into comment there. Step therapy is never a problem. It's administratively easy. et cetera. So tell us from your
I think
perspective,
it's-
what's a responsible step therapy look like, if there is one?
Right. We have felt how uncomfortable for parents is to be here and make, their point of view. But the providers, we are in that room with that particular patient who's now very excited because this new therapy is FDA approved finally. They couldn't get in clinical trials because the criteria were too strict. They couldn't get the Fda because it was too expensive. And now I, the provider, have to tell her, wait a moment, I cannot prescribe it. You're not gonna get it tomorrow because you have to try prednisone for 6 months. And many of the policies is not just this kind of loose common sense step therapy. Well, if they have side effects from prednisone, I have many policies that tells me you have to try for 6 months. Have you ever lived 6 months with the kids that jumps off the wall for behavioral, or that keeps on gaining weight over 2 or 3 weeks, and once you get the weight gain, you can't get it off? So I think it's really the devil is in the details, that now we hope we had choices left to the patients and the providers, but truly we don't have choices. There are some families that are unequivocally, I want to start the Fda first, right off the bat, without doing any trial of prednisone. I have good medical reason. Now I have to make a decision that is not medical, it's purely because of access. So, and that's very frustrating.
I would like to add that I wouldn't think it to be appropriate, and I wouldn't support a timed trial of a medication when toxicity is being documented. And our policy does not support that and wouldn't support that. So if toxicity is starting to show, any time trial would no longer be necessary.
An important distinction, because a lot of step therapy is a trial, an adequate trial to see if there's a benefit. But if you're dealing with a toxicity issue, to wait 6 months and then before you have to, I think that's a very important difference.
That's true of ours also, and I would add that for the demonstration of efficacy, in a situation like this, we would reach out to our local experts at our children's hospital, which we did. We had a conversation. They pointed out, incidentally, the issue of 6-minute walk test versus arm strength measures.
Yep.
We followed there. So we'll say to them, what do you think successful response looks like? How long should we wait before we ask you to? And then just, again, show me chart notes that that happened, and then we check the box.
All right. Let me be rude and start to ignore people, because I will be flogged if we don't get through Teplerson's coverage criteria, because that's where a lot of the struggles are as well. But I'm not going to let one of the empty chairs go by without, I don't have something to read off the table, but I have a hard time believing that many patients feel that it was a great thing that a drug was approved by the FDA that was available overseas for under $1,000 and it cost $81,000. I don't think many people benefited from that except for the manufacturer. Ultimately, I could be wrong, and so I'm open to other thoughts on why that was a good thing. I know people wanted access to it, and maybe it was hard to get from overseas, but that is a mechanism of innovation. Feels wrong. We should be able to do better innovation than taking an existing drug that's cheap elsewhere and somehow gin it up to get it through the FDA at a price like that. So I'm going to make a pretty declarative statement on that, and if there's any strong comeback that you'd like to make, otherwise we'll turn to a Teplerson. Okay, so they heard that, I hope. A Teplerson, patient criteria, same issues. Clinical criteria from the studies translated into prior auth. So we see some coverage policies that say patients only between the ages of 7 and 13. Your kid is diagnosed at age 5, have to wait till age 7. You have to be ambulatory and have ambulatory motor function with or without assistance to be able to walk at least 180 meters in 6 minutes. We see this in different permutations across different kinds of coverage policies around the country here. And the renewal criteria after 6 months or a year or what have you is often the same thing. They have to still meet those criteria. I have no idea what happens if they reach age 13. Do they really turn off the spigot? I don't know. But what's the experience so far from the patient community in grappling with these types of prior auth criteria? we'll try to be brief because then I want to pivot back to the insurers and look for some way to think about best practice. How, again, do we wrestle with the translation of the eligibility criteria into the prior auth criteria? So what's happening in the patient?
I'll speak to that a little bit, mainly by telling our personal experience. So we enrolled in that trial, as I've mentioned many times, and when we completed the trial, we were fortunate in that we were able to transition to commercial access through our insurer, who is not represented here at the table. However, we were denied through our initial request for authorization and went through a first level of appeal and won. Later found out that we were denied because our insurer was not aware of the FDA's approval of the drug.
That's probably not best practice.
Yeah. So having become aware, fortunately, we were approved for 1 year, conditional to them coming back and developing a policy. We were 7 months into getting commercial access, and lo and behold, started receiving denials of claims that were being processed through the provider. No notification from our insurance company to anyone that they were going to suddenly deny during the 1 year period that they had approved us. And not only did they start denying us as of the date of the letter, they clawed back to all the previous dates that they had authorized us for. Following that, the insurance company continued to battle our provider, who thankfully took on the appeal process for us, and that is still ongoing. So we began to get the drug, fortunately, from Sarepta on a bridge program. We were fortunate. Others don't have that ability to get the drug and have that continuation of therapy through a bridge program, but we were able to access that due to the fact that they offer that. Okay. Since then, we actually applied for reauthorization and have had to go through an appeal process once again, and miraculously 2 months ago received a letter in the mail saying that they had approved us for 1 more year. So in our world, in our family's perspective, and I know we're not the only story out there, there's something clearly broken with the payer policy and the inconsistency in it. I know that we know that, and that's not new news. But we have a major opportunity to include the patient voice in these conversations and get up front and start to develop these policies that make sense for the individuals. So the exclusion criteria or inclusion criteria in the clinical trials is really dangerous to include up front in these policies with so much unknown that there is about this. And what we're finding is they're just blanket policies or no policies being thrown out there, and patients are having to go all the way to external appeal. I don't know if any of you have ever been through that, but external appeal can take a year or more to get there if you're lucky. So imagine these kids who, as Emma said, are excited in the office to have the ability to get on a new commercially available drug, and it takes them a year. And we've already learned what a year does in the life of Duchenne.
I'm really sorry for everything you've had to go through. I can only imagine. Can I ask quickly to go back to the insurers so we get a rich discussion of what's the right way through this wicket, and how do we understand what's the right signal to send about how to do this? We know that some major national insurers, the day it was approved, said we are not covering it, full stop, because we don't think the evidence is adequate, full stop. You can comment on that as well, but this idea of using the eligibility criteria, I'm not even going to talk about post hoc use of it because there's some clear should not do's. But again, this basic issue, and again, you probably went through this in your own group, looking at the clinical trial data and eligibility criteria. What's the right way to send a signal on how to do that responsibly?
Yeah,
Eric, John, go ahead.
I've already talked about this to some extent, but the issue for us was the 6-minute walk test. And of course, there's somebody that comes back and says, well, why don't you enforce that? We had an answer because we had already talked to our local clinician experts and they had explained it. And it was nice because Spinraza came out at about the same time, and so we were able to discuss both. And the same principle applies, and it makes total sense that if you're in a wheelchair, arm strength is very important. It can make a difference in things like how long you can drive a specially equipped vehicle. So that's a case where the argument made sense and we accepted it. We do require a once a year, basically review of chart notes. We're looking at, whatever they've been tracking and have been pretty lenient in reviews, especially since the historical control study came out showing that there was some apparent reduction in the rate of decline.
So the only reason I can imagine of checking, honestly, I mean, I guess you could always assume that it's the wrong patient getting it or whatever, but if they bring it to the right patient a year in, unless you're going to decide to do something different if they're no longer ambulatory, what are you really checking for at a year?
Can I speak to that just now? So my insurer is at the table, and I have,
Another empty chair. We got lots of them down here.
no.
Oh, they are. I'm sorry.
And I had actually quite the opposite experience.
Uh-huh.
And I have zero faith in the 6-minute walk to kind of establish any type of treatment benefit or to mark disease progression in more than a very, very cursory way in Duchenne. I mean, I think if you're looking at 6-minute walk, it's an endurance event, and there are a lot of factors that go into endurance performance beyond just muscular strength. And so my local clinician and I came up, with the kind of case study presentation of looking at 10-meter walk rather than 6-minute walk. Because also, I think it's kind of inhumane to put these kids through a 6-minute walk. They can fall. You're exhausting them to the point where they're a fall risk, which means they're a fracture risk. So I think it's kind of an unethical test to perform, and you don't gain any extra information from it than you would doing a 10-meter walk in an ambulatory patient. So and also I didn't have a baseline 6-minute walk when my son started on treatment because he had fractured his femur just prior. And so we did have a 10-meter walk though. And so my insurer was flexible in being patient-specific about the evidence that we demonstrated. So
Good. I'm glad. One thing that I think we could use as a formal policy recommendation is that you should be cloned and sent to every rare disease in the world and inserted like a vector early in the development pathway. Because I think one policy thing is that patient groups need to realize, you see those patient outcomes that the manufacturer is using for the development of the drug that you really want access to if it works? It's a double-edged sword. It may seem like it's easy or the right one to get through the FDA or whatever, but it is going to be the one that insurers are going to look at and maybe bake into their coverage policies. So push the companies to do studies with outcomes that are rich enough, nuanced enough to capture the breadth of the patients who could benefit from this treatment. We may learn that it doesn't work for all of them. That's even better. If we have to learn that, we learn it early. But I think that there was a real opportunity lost here for multiple reasons probably, but that going forward, there's a real benefit for having patient representatives like you who can help work with the manufacturers to do a better job with their outcome measures. Everybody wins that way. I'm really sorry about the time because I'm going to have to jump forward, but I do think that I want to talk just about the price. One of the many 800-pound gorillas or more in the room. It's been talked about as a policy platform. If we want accelerated approval, if we want drugs quicker to offer the hope of an early access and response, especially to conditions that have rapid progressive declines, how should the price reflect that? Should it? Does it mean that if the orphan drug price is $300,000, a term that I really hate because it's completely divorced from whether it works or not, but for a drug that really slips through quick, which is good sometimes if we want to learn more about it, what if the drug were priced at a much lower level and we build up, and we do have this kind of meeting at 2 or 3 years, when we should have better evidence and we can juice up that price if the drug is doing good things for patients. The way it's handled now, again, I think it creates this tremendous tension. If this drug were priced, I think, far lower, and I'll ask you guys, would it have changed anything about the approach, not just of you guys, but of the other insurers, the way they reacted out of the gate with this one? Would we be in a different place? Is there a way to think of a price reflecting uncertainty that could be a better way forward for the system?
Yeah, obviously when you...
Leading the witness, but...
I would say when you couple a significantly high price with limited to no outcomes at launch. That's, like I said, it was one of the 4 seminal events that I could think of. And, you know, to the model's results here, and I appreciate the UIC team that did it, but obviously it's very complex. But it can, in a simplistic fashion, as a payer is looking at, you know, the ICER report, our ICER evaluations are beneficial. They're one data point that guides the interpretation of that. And if you want to take the most optimistic view, and that you want this drug to work, and you want it to be able to give it to the patients that need it, if it's as simple as if you, at baseline, their utility is 0 and it goes to 1,
Right.
and you take the caregivers, both of them, and say they went from 0 to 1, so there can be no discussion of the subtleties of the metrics. All that. It's like they went from 0 to perfect. And you take that in a chronically administered drug, and that ICER, and that is still over 330,000, there's a disconnect. And so, yeah, that's where the backlash came from. And it's not about the nuance of the outcomes, the lack of outcomes, the nuance of the individual patient, but it's a where does it, and so when I talk about, and it's unique in the fact that I feel like I've been on the cystic fibrosis panel, the SMA panel. You know, Kalydeco came out, and the rationale for that price was it's only 4% of the population. It's only 4% of the population. Don't worry about it. You're not going to deal with it. And then came Orkambi, and then came Symdeko. So their 4% of the population came out to 60%. And then in a year, we may get 90%. But the Orkambi and Symdeko price was, well, we priced it here because this is what Kalydeco said, and the market could bear that.
Right.
And we see that Exondys came out, and it's 13%. Don't worry, you're not going to account for that. And then, you know, but then on top of it, it came back to 6 years ago when I would meet with manufacturers with their, you know, and they're talking about their pipe. They would come in and they'd come in with their models, and they would discuss their models. And, you know, there could be some disagreement. And what I had a conversation with the other day with a manufacturer, and their price was uniquely $375,000, and there was no pharmacoeconomic model. And they go, well, it's on par with drugs that have been launched. So as you say, $300,000 seems to be that media non-raise their antenna, which coincidentally was the price that was launched for Exondys. Granted, that was the question. That was for a 12 kilo
Small
patient.
kid, right?
A 12 kilo patient, where we talked 40 kilograms was $1 million.
Right.
But 300 was what got in the media. So yeah, all of those things came together to have a unfortunate, you know, but probably necessary reaction.
Okay. I'm going to beg everyone's forgiveness, but I do want to give you guys a chance to have a concluding statement and to have some final words from the CEPAC themselves so that we can finish by 4. So I know there are other important issues that I'm sure many of you in the audience would have liked for me to cover as well, but we'll just have to kind of move forward at this point, because I want to thank you all for your thoughtful comments and give you one more chance. Again, please make a comment about anything you want, but it could be something that you think is really a key theme that you don't want this meeting and this report to leave without hammering in again, or a new view, or it can be a request, a thought going forward. And I very much apologize, by the way, that we haven't had a chance to talk enough about outcome measures going forward. We got a little bit of a bite at that earlier in the day, but that was one of the topics I didn't get a chance to go to. So feel free to introduce something, and may I start with the clinical experts? Make a request to somebody of something that could be better, or some final comment. Oh, and one sentence, please.
One sentence.
As I always say, with you've been through this before, with a semicolon. And
I'm Italian, I can do long sentences. Right?
If you're judicious with the semicolon, it can be...
Like Dante sentence.
Right. Yeah. The classically trained. All right.
I would like for the public who are not maybe as familiar with rare diseases and Duchenne to be aware of what a magnificent time is in terms of development of truly new disease-modifying. I think we're really at the verge of making a huge difference in patients' life like never before. In rare diseases, there are very serious diseases, and we had some good successes, and with great success comes great responsibility, and I think the responsibility sits with society at large to make it work. to spend 50 years of research funded by taxpayer to discover new, novel, exciting treatment and then fail into have and I don't think that we can afford that. So we have to really think outside the box economically and among different stakeholders to really make it work and moving forward. We don't want to move backward and miss opportunity of something that really can make a huge difference.
Thank you very much. Peter?
So I've learned a lot today, especially from members of the patient community, and I'm very grateful for that. One take-home message that I'm taking from this is there's a really sore need for a consensus on a more meaningful outcome measure for Duchenne muscular dystrophy for clinical trials moving forward, as well as studies that will happen post-approval for novel therapies that I hope to get approved. And that's one of many things that I think we can all work together on.
Okay, thank you. Let me go to the insurers, and we'll have you guys be able to have the final word on this part. John?
Yeah, I'll put on my pharmacist hat for a minute. I have a suggestion for the people facing the deflazacort versus prednisone decision, and which is to do what we call a single patient trial. And this is it's actually a controlled, randomized controlled trial where your pharmacist will disguise the pills so that you can't tell which one is which. And then you cross over the patient over appropriate time intervals and however many times you need. And it's double-blinded. The provider doesn't know which, and you keep diaries or use whatever measures you want. And then you can tell at the end of that time, gee, that child's behavior really wasn't any different on these two, or maybe they gained more weight with this one than they did with the other. But since those effects are individual to some extent, you can then see whether this patient really would benefit from deflazacort. And if not, let's save the money so we can pay for the Exondys.
All right, thank you. Eric?
Yeah, first I want to thank the patient families, and the advocates here today for their comments. I really appreciate them. I think that my comment that I would like to have is obviously in the setting of neurodegenerative conditions, much research has been out there, and I looked, as Dr. Sheffaloni said, a great responsibility. I look forward to, from the payer system, partnership with the provider community and the specialist community to help us understand those nuances, to help us understand how we can balance access, longitudinal monitoring, and how to ensure that the patients who are truly benefiting from these medications get them and stay on them. And if there can be documentation of where there is waste in the system and there is no benefit being added, remove that waste so that we can expand access.
Thank you very much. All right, you guys can arm wrestle for it. Brian, please.
So the point I'd like to make is that Duchenne is an extraordinarily complicated condition. It confounds the academics, it confounds clinicians, it confounds the sponsors and the payers, and it really frustrates families. And I think that was evidenced by many of the discussions today. And my urging would be for the community as a whole to come together to develop these more robust, appropriate outcome measures. Certainly Mindy's work is part of that equation, Mindy and Christine. And I think that ultimately, until we reach a point where we're able to actually capture what is an appropriate measure of functional benefit and what is important and relevant to the patient, where we're going to wind up having these tense discussions going forward.
Great, thank you. Dawn.
Yeah, in addition to what everyone has said, I certainly agree with those thoughts so far, and I don't know that I'll add a whole lot different other than to say there's a lot of great dialogue going on in the community. We're an example of it here today where the patient voice is starting to be heard and included. It's almost a buzzword a bit right now. And I would just like to see that come to reality. So my hope is that as we move forward in these conversations and move forward in the advancement of innovation, I would love to see the patient voice actually inserted more. So whether it be this report of today's results, whether it be future clinical trial design, we want a seat at the table. And I think the perception may have been for some time that we were kind of working against each other. You know, hopefully you guys have been able to see us today. We're well educated. We're not emotional. We're here to develop and move this thing forward. And all that we really want at the end of the day is a seat at the table so that our kids don't continue to be on the menu.
Thank you very much. Mindy.
So I think I just want to build on what Don was saying, that I think sometimes in difficult situations like this, it's easy to assume kind of antagonistic positions from, you know, in different parties. And I think, you know, being able to have conversations, you know, with the payer side, in understanding, like in particular, you know, literally my local insurance company and their openness to speaking with local clinicians, it helps you to understand kind of the benevolence of everyone's intention that's taking part in the conversation. And I'm appreciative of that, and I just would like to continue to encourage that transparency, because I think it benefits the whole conversation, and just to make sure that we are all, when we're having these conversations, making sure that we are answering the same question, if that makes sense, and articulating where the questions diverge. Like, for example, you know, the ones that we talked about earlier of, you know, does this treatment alter the disease trajectory, is a very different question from, you know, how much, you know, what's a reasonable cost for this medication, in the same way that, you know, is this coverage policy because of the inclusion criteria of the study, because that was the population that would be most apt to demonstrate benefit, or is this the population that is likely to benefit from treatment? Those are different conversations. So just making sure that when we're having those conversations, that we're answering the same questions.
Right. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have the CEPAC make their comments, but before they do, please join me in acknowledging and thanking the members of our policy roundtable. Thank you. Thank you, and I hope you can stay through the end. I know some of you may need to leave, but we are going to finish at 4. CEPAC, your task is to make your comments in 10 minutes. You get no semicolon, all right? Jason, please start us off.
I just wanted to say first that I'm in awe of the courage of the families that have been coming here today, what you've been through. It's been so helpful to me. It's incredibly, you said you're not emotional. It's very emotional for us to hear this. It's really very emotive stuff. This is very, very hard stuff to hear. And I guess, just to state the obvious, these are really, really sick children. And it's very clear to me from this session that we as a medical community, as a society, as academic physicians, need to fight for these kids and get these kids the most help we can as fast as we can. And to me, there's 2 issues. We need better comparative effectiveness research so that people can know what treatment options are right for them when their kids are diagnosed with this and afterwards. And to fundamentally state something that's implicit here but needs to be made very, very clear. When a family has a child that's diagnosed with something so terrible like this, they should never have to worry about incredibly high costs and problems with access. That they have enough to worry about, and the system that we have, if it is a system, of astonishingly high prices set and then very difficult prior authorizations implemented, is not fair to these families and to these patients, and it is something that it continues to be a really difficult thing about our healthcare system, and it really needs to change.
We could almost stop there.
I actually was going to say ditto. I mean, Jason, thank you for starting us off. That I just want to say that this was one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult, ICER meeting I've participated in. And if I'm having this much trouble reading the report and thinking through this and moving through the concerns and then having these conversations all day, I can only imagine what today has been for you and what every day is. So I just wanted to say that I applaud. I admire, and I am humbled by your advocacy and your strength and your courage. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Jason.
I'll echo what my colleague said. This is my first meeting here as a member of the CEPAC, and I am
inspired by your example, the other patients and patient advocates and family members in the room and watching, and your experiences and your advocacy will certainly stay with me as I think about these issues. These are hard issues. These are hard questions of science and medicine and policy and ethics, and there are no easy answers, but a way forward are the kinds of processes, the kinds of venues like this where stakeholders and those are interested and invested and committed and experiencing these challenges can come together in forums like this to think through the best way forward, what we've done and what we need to do. I think it's unfortunate that the manufacturers missed that opportunity. I think we would have learned a lot from their presence, and perhaps they would have as well. But again, thank you for your example and for your work, and it will stay with me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Claudia?
I also want to thank the panelists for giving us the depth of understanding that we couldn't get from just reading the ICER evaluation. However, the situation that we have right now, I mean, similar to what Jason's saying, in that 80% of drug development costs are expected to be paid by the U.S. taxpayer right now, and patients is just not a situation that we can continue with, and we have to look at a more equitable solution and look at more equitable pricing for when new drugs come on the market so it doesn't affect patient access, and we're not there yet by any means.
Thank you very much. Ed?
I would like to say ditto to everything that's been said so eloquently already, and to just add thanks to ICER for making the lemonade out of the lemons so that we could have this excellent discussion.
Thank you very much. Albert?
I also echo sentiments of my colleagues. I got very emotional today, and but it was very eye-opening. I first of all want to thank you for your courage and for being able to share this. This is something I just cannot fathom. That being said, you know, I'm glad that we're able to come together and have these candid, transparent conversations, because that's the start of something. You know, what we see right now, it's just not happening. So at least here, you know, with this report coming out, hopefully this will shift and, you know, inform others and move the needle toward some success. So I thank you.
Thank you very much. Martha?
Thanks, of course, to the panel, as everyone said. I guess I'm struck by the unconscionable amount of money that drugs get charged in this country. And I wonder whether there is banding together of families where orphan drugs are being offered at these high prices to try and figure out a way to put some pressure on pharmaceutical companies. I think that there needs to be a sort of a grassroots movement about this. So that's one thing, and I want to say one other thing. I spoke with Steve about coverage with evidence development, which I gather doesn't really work in this context. But I think about the model of private companies, of pharmaceutical, of insurers, putting together a pool of money where they decide to provide coverage for everybody in the country who needs a drug while the evidence is taken up. And I just wonder if there's a possibility to think more about that as a model for getting financing while we learn how good the evidence is.
Thank you. Greg?
Thank you for being here, and I've really appreciated the insights that I've learned. I think the one thing that's burning in my mind is just the subtlety and complexity of everything that's been covered here, and yet probably the tweets are already, I don't Twitter, but the tweets are probably already flying and the headlines are already flying, and anybody who's going to only look at the headline probably won't get as deep as this comment anyways. But I think reminding everyone that this is complex and that everybody who's involved, patients, providers, families, and even the drug companies that aren't here are really players, and hopefully we can keep this conversation going.
Thank you.
Thank you for panelists and also for ICER and for the consultants and my colleagues for a very rich and stimulating conversation. I think my comment is about payer diversity. I would really like for ICER committee meetings to invite Medicaid payers and their managed care organizations to also have a seat at the table, and also to have a diversity of patients who are not very well insured come and talk about their own experience gaining access. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris?
Thank you very much. I wanted to thank our panelists for being extremely insightful on real-world evidence and the importance of highly curated, intelligent patient-reported outcomes that you've gathered in your own words, which is more rather than less valuable than some of the evidence that's out there, which is just maybe very internally valid, but externally not very valid and not very helpful at all. And I'm talking about the walk test. So that to me led me to think about embracing the technologies that we have at hand and making it very clear to pharma companies that this is something that should be curated, embraced, put into trials from the beginning with your voice, and your voice was heard today, so thank you.
David and Dawn and Mindy, you represented these challenging issues with such grace today, and I greatly admire you. So I'd like to acknowledge the other stakeholders in the room today as well. I'll be keeping a close eye on the pipeline and thinking about your families and your community, and I hope that the pipeline of new drugs is fruitful.
Thanks. Leslie?
Thank you. This is my first meeting. This too has been a very emotional meeting for me. When I first got the report, my first response was, wow. I really want to thank you for helping me to understand the complexity of this disease, but also being able to help me find ways to take this back into the classroom with my students to teach about the clinical evidence, but that there are other benefits and contextual factors that we need to consider. The other thing I would like to say is that I really appreciate you talking about the measures and how we need to think about measuring outcomes in a different way. I also wonder about other measures that maybe we don't always talk about in terms of children's sense of well-being, their confidence, self-worth, and maybe there are other ways that we can look at those outcome measures as well in these therapies.
Thank you very much.
I believe this is the best way we know how to wrestle with a very challenging problem for this disease and many others, and that's to get all the stakeholders in a room in a public process, and a respectful public process, and discuss it. That's patients, providers, payers, the general public. One party's not at the table. That's the manufacturers. They play a huge role, enormous role, in creating the problems we're wrestling with. And I consider it irresponsible for them not to be here today. I am deeply disappointed. It's an abdication of their responsibility of a problem they are right in the middle of. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Jane?
So you've given us a great gift. Thank you. And everybody else has said that in better ways than I can. I've shared my moral outrage earlier in this session, so I won't revisit that. But Austin, thank you for that. I have 3 practical things to wrap. We're sitting in MIT, the home of systems dynamics and modeling. And so I want to, Jay Forrester said, all models are wrong, some models are useful. Without the beginning of the modeling, which we love to beat up on, we wouldn't have the basis for the conversation. So the modeling team, thank you. And this is a useful model because it gives us a place to start talking. I want to urge co-design with patients of both trials and outcomes measures. The cystic fibrosis folks have really been leading in that, and we need to really push the concept of co-design. And then finally, the people who need to hear this aren't here, but we need responsible pricing. We would not be here I mean, we could have these other conversations about coverage policies. That would take us 15 minutes. We would not be here for the fundamental conversation that we're having if we had responsible pricing at the beginning of this process. So again, I thank everyone, and this is also, I've been on CEPAC for a bit. These are challenging conversations, and I'm really honored that we can all be part of them.
Thank you, Jane.
Thanks, Gene. So I've been on CEPAC since the beginning, and I will say that taking everything together, this is probably the most important meeting, or one of the most important meetings we've ever had. And I will just thank everyone for their immense insights and contributions. It's been a great discussion and good work.
Thanks. So it's both a sobering but also in some ways a hopeful day for me. I would really like to thank the patients and families who are in the audience and didn't have a seat up at the table, but whose input has been felt through representatives and in other ways throughout the course of the entire project, and just know that your presence here on the day was important to the meeting in many different ways. Sometimes these meetings are criticized as being bean counting, dry, technical, kind of excising the patients from the process. It's not. For those of you who've been here today, it's an opportunity in which I find expressed in some of the most splendid fashion, true courage to be at this table, true honesty and true humility to try to make decisions in a very difficult context for everybody. And the participation of the patients is always central to that. One thing that we are always conscious of is that there are patients in this room, and there's a metaphorical patient group just outside, waiting for the next meeting, the next new drug, hoping that there's enough money to go around, hoping that their insurance premiums won't be too high, hoping that there's good evidence. And so there's a real need to think broadly about the actions we can take together to address today and tomorrow. And to me, the hopeful ask that I have is that when the drug companies who aren't here, not showing courage, honesty, or humility, when they sit in their rooms making a decision about what evidence to generate and what price to charge, they have a little graph. If you ever want to look at one, you can look at the GAO report, the Senate GAO report that looked into the decision-making around the pricing of Sovaldi. Every company has its own version. There are a couple of columns that they take into consideration around their pricing. One is, will there be pushback from the clinical experts around the evidence or the price? Will there be pushback or support from clinical experts and the patient community? Sometimes they're called key opinion leaders, they call them different things. But there's a power residual in the communities at the table here that need to have a greater voice. And I think they can. And in some areas, we're seeing patient groups and clinical experts work together to have a voice on the evidence that needs to be generated and on the price. And they bring in, obviously, the insurers as part of that. So that same fair price, fair access, and future innovation can really work. It can work with a collaborative effort in which people view the scope of their power as real and as, I think, broad, but that still benefits from collaboration. So insurers, you need to collaborate amongst yourselves to call out bad practice. Let's figure out a way to, we talk about shaming drug companies over pricing. We need a way to state what is a principled approach to good step therapy, a principled approach to responsible translation of eligibility criteria into coverage criteria. We need more from that, more on that from the insurance community in partnership with patients and others. So it's that optimistic sense that we have a real challenge, but an opportunity to work together to do something real in the future that makes what has been a very heavy, emotional day, yet feel deeply meaningful and positive to me. So thank you again for all of the participation, for the outstanding work from the ICER staff, for the CEPAC's work, and the humanity that you bring to this process. And I wish you all a very good day.